I welcome you again. This will be my second lecture with you, which will be on the general arguments of symbolic interactionism. Let's begin with the overview of the topic. We will begin by quickly going through the origins of the perspective of symbolic interactionism. A large number of social scientists have contributed to the development of this perspective, some of whom you may see on the slide, such as George Herbert Mead, John Dewey, Robert Ezra Park, anthropologist Robert Redfield, Florian Zananayki, Charles Horton Cooley, and Louis Wirth. Let's take a moment to look into the beginnings of the symbolic interactionist perspective from Herbert Blumer's observations. He states that the contributions of a number of social scientists who are often associated with this field were mostly unconscious. In fact, they differed in their thought, but at the same time, there was something about their approach to studying human groups which was similar. It was this very similarity which Blumer successfully identified to form the perspective we today call the symbolic interactionist perspective. The objectives of today's lesson are: the first is that students will understand the foundations on which symbolic interactionist perspective rests. Drawing directly from the topic of today's discussion, we will not merely speak of what symbolic interactionist perspective is, but rather the principle and ideas that it is based on. The second is that students will understand the importance of symbols and gestures in the meaning-making process. Unlike the other perspectives in sociology, the symbolic interactionist perspective, for the first time, outlined the importance of the use of language, symbols, and interactions which occupy the domain of the micro to understand how meanings behind actions are generated. Thirdly, students will understand how the social world is created through everyday interactions, gestures, behaviors, symbols, or more simply, things. Under the symbolic interactionist perspective, the key exercise will be to understand how individuals attach meanings to the objects and behaviors around them. It also speaks of how these behaviors are modified and acted upon based on perceived outcomes. The first learning outcome, through discussing the general arguments of symbolic interactionism, is to be able to understand the importance of subjective experiences of people in understanding social reality. Subjectivity includes the perspectives, attitudes, emotions, and desires of individual beings. These ultimately influence how an individual makes sense of the world around him. Considered as an opposite to the idea of objectivity, which speaks of broad, universally accepted forces located at a distance from the individual, subjectivity shows how individual experiences, ideals, and principles, considered as an opposite to the idea of objectivity, which speaks of broad, universally accepted forces located at a distance from the individual, subjectivity shows how individual experiences, ideals, and principles guides the way social reality is interpreted. The second learning outcome, which is expected out of this lesson, is to help students understand that symbolic interactionism is an approach to qualitative research. Symbolic interactionism encouraged the use of qualitative methods in social science research. as it propagated the use of methods such as participant observation and immersive study that allow researchers to understand culture and communities through micro interactions between actors, the symbols they use, and the meanings they attach to behaviors. The last outcome, which is expected, is that students will be introduced to one of the dilemmas persisting in social sciences, that is, of the individual and structure debate. The debate is also known as the structure versus agency debate. Structures are established patterns or arrangements that may influence actions, opportunities, or choices of individuals. On the other hand, agency, a concept which is widely popular in the symbolic interactionist perspective, refers to the ability of actors or individuals to carry out actions independently. When we look at the rather amorphous beginnings of social interactionism, Bloomer credits George Herbert Mead as being the first to lay the foundations of the perspective. The term symbolic interactionism, however, was first used by Bloomer himself in 1937 in an article he published with the journal Man and Society. And the act of coining the term he called a barbaric neologism. According to Bloomer, symbolic interactionism is based on three premises. The first thing to discuss under the general arguments of symbolic interactionism, therefore, are the three basic premises on the nature of symbolic interactionism, and this has been pointed out by Herbert Bloomer. So we begin. The first is, and I quote Bloomer, human beings act towards things on the basis of the meanings that things have for them. These things that Bloomer speaks of are everyday encounters. He points to these things as being others in an individual's life, such as a mother, friends, enemies. It could be inanimate objects, such as a chair or a tree, intangible aspects like ideals and principles that individuals hold dearly to, such as honesty or independence, or even commands or requests. Thus, things are all that human beings note in their world. Bloomer, at this point, believed that though the first premise may rarely invite objection, it is something that social science and psychology have neglected. According to him, meanings are rarely brought into serious intellectual discussions, and individuals are usually seen as actors on whom influence of various factors is exerted. It is usually the predominance of structures that aid in generating meaning. For instance, psychologists may find stimuli and conscious motives as being important factors. A sociologist may utilize social position, norms, values, or even social pressures and affiliation as factors behind the meaning making process. Symbolic interactionism, however, disapproves placing great importance on the factors generating meaning and believes that meaning is already central to things, and to ignore meanings that things have for individuals once again overlooks the vital role that meanings play in the formation of human behavior. The second premise is that meaning of such things is derived or arise out of social interaction that one has with one's fellows. The second premise thus deals with the origin of meaning. For this, Bloomer identified two explanations behind the source of meaning. The first he calls the traditionalist explanation, of which there are two more. The first is where the meaning is generated by the object or thing itself, which makes meaning an intrinsic quality of objects, such as a cloud is a cloud and a cow is a cow. The second traditionalist explanation is of meaning being a psychical accretion or an expression of the human psyche. Bloomer gives us the example of prostitution, for instance, to state how an individual's attitude may guide the meaning that prostitution has for him. Sensations, memories, or even feelings, when associated with perception, give rise to this source of meaning. Symbolic interactionism is a departure from both these traditional explanations, since it identifies the source of meaning being the interaction process between persons. How people act towards one another gives meanings to things, thus, meaning is a social process. The third premise states that meanings are handled in and modified through an interpretative process used by the person in dealing with the things he encounters. To be precise, human beings make meanings through the interpretative process in interaction. The process of interpretation is not mere application of meaning to things. Rather, it is the actual process by which persons, in Bloomer's words, selects, checks, suspends, regroups, and transforms the meanings in light of the situation in which he is placed. We will now look at some key ideas that constitute symbolic interactionism. The first key idea is of the nature of human society. Beyond the three premises, symbolic interaction also has some root images or basic ideas. Through these root images, symbolic interactionism tries to understand human society. The first image or idea of society is the nature of human society or human group life. Humans in human groups engage in a multitude of actions. Hence, human groups, Bloomer states, exist in action. In fact, culture and social structure are also derivations of human action. For instance, culture, including customs, tradition, norms, or law, is a product or is derived from what people do or their actions. Social structure, too, which exists in the form of social position, status, role, authority, or prestige, is a product of human interactions with one another, or in other words, how persons treat one another. Society is therefore a complex of ongoing activity. This brings us to the first cardinal principle of symbolic interactionism. That is, if human society is to be understood, then one must acknowledge that human groups or societies begin and end in social action. In symbolic interactionism, social interaction receives central attention, unlike the treatment it has received from disciplines such as sociology or psychology, where interaction is seen as a medium between the determinants of behaviors and the produced behavior. In symbolic interactionism, however, social interaction is given its importance because interaction forms human behavior. This is because when human beings act with one another, the actor must take into account the behavior of others. Thus, a person's actions or behavior is always in relation to the action of others. It is a way of fitting one's actions into the actions of others. In order to understand this concept in detail, Bloomer has cited the works of George Herbert Mead's symbolic level of interactionism. In order to understand this aspect in detail, Bloomer suggests that we look into George Herbert Mead's idea of the symbolic level of interaction. In this context, discussing a bit on George Herbert Mead's approach to understanding the symbolic level of human interaction will be beneficial. Mead spoke in terms of the presentation of gestures and the meaning of those gestures. Gesture is a part of an ongoing action which also signifies a larger act. For example, the shaking of a fist may indicate a possible attack. These gestures are directed at persons who can recognize them, receives cues on the intention of the gesture, and prepares his actions accordingly. The response is usually decided on the actions based on the cues of these gestures. So we can say that gestures have meaning for the person who makes it as well as for the person to whom it is directed. Mead's analysis of gestures follows triadic nature. This triadic nature includes, firstly, that gestures signify what the person it is directed is to do. The second is that it signifies what the maker of the gesture is to do. And lastly, also signifies the joint action that is to arise through the understanding of the acts of both. To illustrate Mead's idea of symbolic level of human interaction, I have provided you with a children's poem. The poem indicates the role of gestures or symbols in creating actions for both the maker and the actor to whom it is directed. Here, the gesture of wearing a helmet or holding a club directs all onlookers to understand that the constable is on a mission to catch a thief or burglar. Even when the policeman raises his hands, cars know that they must stop. We then move into another concept by George Herbert Mead, which is the idea of mutual role taking. An important point to understand in human interaction is that all actors involved in interaction must take on each other's roles. This is what Mead termed as role taking. To give you an example, let's take, for instance, a robber who commands his victims to raise their hands. In order for the robber to accomplish his actions, the robber must also see the hands being raised to confirm the response. The robber thus sees things from the point of view of the victims, and in turn, the victim assesses the possible action of the robber if hands are not raised. This mutual role taking is an essential component in effective symbolic interaction. The next root image that Bloomer speaks of are objects. So we now look at the third key idea of social interactionism, which is the nature of objects. For symbolic interactionists, the world of humans or groups is comprised of what is called objects. Objects are identified as anything that can be referred to or pointed at. These objects can be broadly divided into three categories. The first are physical objects, such as a purse, cloth, or a book. These are also called tangible objects. The second are social objects that are capable of undertaking human actions, such as a friend, a student, a mother, or the president of a country. The third are intangible or abstract objects, such as morals, principles, or philosophical doctrines, ideas like that of independence, justice, or even exploitation. By nature of an object, it is implied that the meaning the object has for a person. The meaning of an object can be different for different individuals. For example, the Prime Minister can be a very different object to a member of his political party than to someone from the opposition. Another example would be that of a tree. The next idea of symbolic interactionism, or the fourth root idea, is of the human actor. To G.H. Mead, a human being is someone who not only interacts, but is someone who is able to send indications and interpret those indications too. This interaction is also only possible when human beings possess a self. This means that a person can be an object of his own actions too. It is to him that he first recognizes himself as being, for example, a struggling student, someone who is in debt, or being of young age. Just like other objects, the self of any person is also an object that develops through social interaction. The self is formed when others define who he is to the person himself. A person gradually becomes an object to oneself as he begins to see himself from the outside, thus engaging in what is called a process of self interaction. The act of viewing oneself from outside is possible through Mead's stages of development of the self. The first stage is known as the play stage, where individuals take on the role of discrete individuals. The second stage is called the game stage, where individuals take up the role of organized groups. And the final and last stage, also known as the stage of the generalized other, is where roles of the abstract community are played out. Let's move to the next idea of social interactionism. The fifth root idea, which Bloomer speaks of, and which is a part of social interactionism, is the nature of human actions. Bloomer quite efficiently draws out the distinct nature of human acts as perceived by symbolic interactionists. Human actions not only constitute responding to the world that one confronts, but also interprets it. Human actions not only constitute responding to the world that one confronts, but also interprets it. Interpretative actions include, firstly, coping with the new situation a person is confronted with, and secondly, he has to understand the meanings of the actions of others to finally map out his own course of action. Therefore, human action in symbolic interactionism consists of two major processes. The first is the process of sending indications, and the second is of these indications to be interpreted. Based on this, a range of actions may occur. Some actions may be started, others may be stopped, some actions may be abandoned or completely stopped. A last minute remark is often made regarding collective behavior by Bloomer, in which individual actions may be adjusted to that of others in the organized group. Collective behavior also goes through the interpretative process of noting what is actually happening in its area of operation. The last idea or root image that symbolic interactionism considers is an elaboration of joint actions which falls within the broad heading of interconnections of the lines of action. Joint actions are not mere aggregations and must not be broken down into separate acts. In fact, individual members may not necessarily be identified in joint actions, such as a family is always seen in its totality, or even the example of church here. In fact, individual members may not necessarily be identified in joint actions, such as that in families, it is usually seen as an institution in its totality. The same goes for a church. Joint actions must be understood as interlinkage, separate acts of participants. These joint actions may follow the same processes of designation and interpretation that characterize individual human action. Lastly, joint actions are constantly being repeated and reformulated to form new actions for the organized group. As we near the end of this lesson, let us quickly go in for an exercise. As you may see on the slide, there are two pictures. Let's deal with the first. What do you see? Yes, that's a black cat. Now let's analyze the meanings behind the picture of the black cat, which can be treated as a symbol here. How then can we trace the differences in meaning behind a black cat in the symbolic interactionist perspective? From the first premise or argument of symbolic interactionism, we know that human beings act towards things on the basis of the meanings that the things have for them. Following this, we can say that people in India may approach the idea of a black cat with fear, as in the Indian culture, black cats signify bad luck. In Japan, however, since black cats are perceived as a sign of prosperity, their behavior may be more welcoming. In Egypt, again, since black cats represent the goddess of fertility and childbirth, the image of a black cat may generate feelings of reverence. Let's look at the second picture. The second picture is that of a demonetized 500 rupee note. At one point, you may agree that this note held great value to us. However, very few people would want to save a note such as this today. Such actions can be explained with a third premise, which states that meanings of objects can be modified through the interpretative process. In the case of the old 500 rupee note, people now devalue it since its use in transactions is severely restricted. Thus, the meaning behind an old 500 rupee note has surely changed. Before we end the lesson, the shortcomings of the symbolic interactionist perspective must also be discussed. We know that this perspective places great importance on individual behavior, and as such, it quite effectively analyzes individual behavior. But such a perspective does not adequately and effectively explain behaviors of large systems which fall within the macro analysis of society. Further, we also see that symbolic interactionism deals specifically with meanings and symbols, which are cultural products. And cultural meanings, behaviors, and symbols are different across cultures. This makes the symbolic interactionist perspective a rather complex and lofty endeavor. Finally, while individual agency is given great importance in the symbolic interactionist perspective, overlooking external forces or structural influences raises the question, to what degree does an individual actor create one's own reality? Oftentimes, seemingly individual actions or meanings may have a series of external and structural influence which go unaddressed in this perspective. Symbolic interactionism, in its most evolved state, is indebted to the works of Erving Goffman, who was against being clamped within one theoretical tradition. In his path-breaking work on dramaturgy, which consisted of an array of terms which would later become synonymous with his theoretical tradition, dramaturgy was Goffman's attempt at understanding motives behind actors' actions, thereby hinting at underlying structures of actions, speech, and even interaction. Erving Goffman's approach was thus an attempt at bridging the gaps persistent in the symbolic interactionist perspective. With this, we end our lesson on the general arguments of symbolic interactionism. I have listed out some questions for you to practice, and the list of referred texts and suggested readings are also given. Thank you.